رمضان 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 يا حبيب رمضان رمضان ليتك دوما قريب
Rabbi Shali wa isili hamri wa lugdata minisani yafka kali. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Hamdan kathira tayyiban barakafi. Let me first start by thanking my brother Lukman and the team at AIC for the invitation, but more importantly, for their efforts in Dawah and for keeping faith. Because this is the 14th edition of this program. So may Allah reward you and your team for all that you do, and may Allah accept it as your own service and worship. Let me also note that I obviously was not sent a memo, or I didn't get the memo that there's a Kampala or a dire or a green color for this occasion. If the memo was sent, I missed that. And let me also correct one of the little things that was said about me by Ajia when she was introducing me earlier as the president of NASFT. I am a former president of NASFT. Today I'm just Olaniyi Yusuf. I was president of NASFT from 2019 till February 2024. So from February, someone else, my brother Abdul Rahuf, is now the president of NASFT. And I think the last thing I would like to say before I get into my speech, right, on my presentation, and I see is there, is that I was in this same hall, I think it was the weekend before Ramadan, speaking on also about the economy with the Unilag Muslim Alumni Ummah. So for those of us who were part of that session, a number of the things I will say today will be similar, because the economy has not changed significantly in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Even though the dollar volatility has reduced and is now more stable, and it's dropping from 1,006 to how much? 1,314, 1,380, 1,350. Amazing. Why are we so concerned about that anyway? Because really, that doesn't have that. I mean, how many of us spend dollars every day? But it's been part of our life in the last few years. Right. So I've been asked to speak about the state of the economy facts. I note that the mandate does not include solutions. Because if they wanted a solution, they will have called the central bank governor of the Honorable Minister of Finance. So they've put me in my lane, and I will also do well to stay in my lane. So what I will be sharing will be some information that most of us are aware of. If you go to the next slide, please. But I also will speak a bit from my own view of what the challenges are and what the prospects for the nation, what are our prospects. So the jackpot slang has come into our lexicon in the last few years. But I think there is much opportunities in this climb. I share a thought about the kind of reforms and the changes that we need, and then I'll conclude. And so those are the 5 things I hope to speak to you about in the next 30 minutes or so. You go to the next slide. So Nigeria is a paradox. A paradox in the sense that you have things that are good and beautiful, but you also have its own challenges. And like they said, to every a coin has two sides. So really that shouldn't be surprising. And we have some things that have stayed constant in the country. So a number of the things that are good, including the land mass. Nigeria is the 32nd largest country in the world. Almost 1 million square kilometers of land. And I think it's the 12th or so on the continent, but it's 32nd on the world. We are the 8th largest exporter of crude oil. And we have the 10th largest gas reserves. And of course, we see this in our lives because crude oil and gas accounts for about 95% of our exports. So the cocoa, the sesame street, the sesame, the cashew, other things that we export account for less than 5% of our export proceeds. But crude oil and gas accounts for 95% of our FX. So when you want more FX and when you want the Naira to be strong, then we've got to export more. And export more than what we import. It's the largest African economy, about $477 billion economy. And we've had more than 20 years, about 25 years of stable civilian administration of democracy. And if you notice in the last 3, 4, 5 years, almost the entire Sahelian belt, there have been military coup on the continent. But Nigeria still remains a stable democracy. We have natural resources, gold, bitumen, the second largest bitumen reserves in the world, lithium, and many other natural resources abound there. We have a coastline of 853 kilometers. So while in the Caribbean islands, they've developed their coastline and we all go to Antigua, to Jamaica, to St. Louis, etc. for holiday. We also have same 853 kilometers of coastline that we can really turn into tourist destination. Inland waterways, about 14 million hectares of inland waterways. We have a huge population, 220 million people, of which 70% of us are below the age of 35. More than 96% of us were born after the Civil War. And so it's a very young population. And that population, if it is skilled with the right skills, will be the workforce of tomorrow. That population will be the consumer class of tomorrow that will buy items. Or that population could also be the youth that are angry, that can fight if they don't have the right skills, if they don't have the required talent. We've got a decent internet coverage. So over 70 million hectares of agricultural land. Financial inclusion is now above 70%. Was about 50-something% a few years ago, but that has improved. Corruption index has improved slightly. We are now 145th from 146 in 2019. And our competitiveness index has also increased slightly. So in terms of global competitiveness index, we are now 114 from 116. So 2 places. We've jumped 2 places in terms of the nation being competitive. So those are improving. Some things remain constant. The people, diverse, resilient, and I would say optimistic Nigerians. We see the sunny side of life always. So that remains consistent. Oil and gas account for 95% of earnings, of FX earnings. That also remains consistent. But a number of things are not going well. Insecurity is increasing. Terrorism is increasing. Our Human Development Index, investment in health, in education, in nutrition is reducing. Investment in the country, especially from foreign investors, reduced in the last decade. And of course, cost of living, inflation are all going up. So it's a nation where you have the endowment to be prosperous. But the reality is that we are not yet prosperous. And that's the fact that faces us today as Nigerians. If you go to the next slide. So, a nation that has the potential, but that nation has been struggling for decades. And you ask yourself, why? And my own sense is that we play too much. We don't have a sense of urgency. We don't take ourselves seriously enough. For as long as I can remember, we've been talking about NEPA, never expect power, always. And over 3 decades, we've been struggling to provide power. Within 3 years, Egypt provided about 14.4 gigawatts of power in 2016. A contract they signed with Siemens. Nigeria also signed a contract with Siemens in 2019. Egypt signed 2016, and by 2018, 3 years, contract done, power delivered. Nigeria signed 2019. Hopefully tomorrow, power will be delivered. Yet, power is quite important, or electricity is quite important to everything that we do. So we know the solution, but the sense of urgency to implement just does not seem to be there enough. For over 2 decades, we've been trying to fix our refineries, and we've been importing petrol. And we're still trying to fix the refineries. But now Dangote, in like 5 years or so, has shown what is possible. Brand new refinery. So we export crude oil and we import petrol. In 2012, Oronsaye report was submitted because we had concerns about cost of governance and that we wanted to reduce the cost of governance. So 12 years after, we now want to implement it. After 2 or 3 panels have been set up to review and 3 white reports. And in the process of doing all that, we've moved from 500 plus agencies. We've pretty much almost doubled the number of agencies. So when we should be reducing, because we want to reduce the cost of governance, we've moved to 900 plus agencies from 541. The last time inflation was single digit was January 2016. So, and about the same time was when the farmers' elders clashes intensified. Because one of the major reasons for inflation in Nigeria is food inflation. Today, headline inflation is about 32.7%. Food inflation is about 37.9%. So food is a huge chunk of our cost of inflation. And so when the farmers' elders clashes started, we didn't think or we didn't connect it that if farmers are not able to go to farm, if cattle are not able to eat grasses and co, someday there will not be enough food, which has now happened to us. And so 2016, inflation has been double digits and it continues to be. And so you ask yourself, why do we allow things to go from bad to worse before we act? On April 15, 2014, that night was when the Chibok girls were kidnapped. So, in another 3 weeks, will be 10 years that the Chibok girls were kidnapped. But since then, there have been more kidnapping. In the last 1 month in Kaduna, between February and March in Kaduna, 452 persons were kidnapped in 1 month. And if farmers can't go to farm because they will be kidnapped, that means they are not able to plant. And once you miss the planting season, there's nothing to harvest. So those are our facts. Those are some of our realities. Climate change is affecting us. In 2022, we had a huge flood that affected 33 of our 36 states. There's desertification, there's encroachment, etc. There is rapid urbanization. Urbanization is said to be at about 53%. That means more of us are leaving the rural area to come to the urban areas in search of the golden fleece. And because we've not planned, the government has not planned for this influx of people, what happens? Everybody turns into his own local government. You provide your own water, you provide your own electricity, you provide your own roads, you do stuff. So instead of working together to fix the problem, individually we decide to solve for ourselves. Forgetting that if you don't solve as a community, like they say, Olowo kan, Otoshi mefa, Otoshi ni gbogbo won. We love businesses, government love regulations, but there is what people call regulatory overreach, where our regulators are not helping businesses enough, in fact they are busy looking for ways to tax businesses. Between Adamawa in the northeast and Uyo, you will encounter 154 checkpoints. 154 checkpoints. Now you might say, okay, yeah, there's crisis in Benue and insecurity, and that's why you have 154 checkpoints. Which is true. But between Agbara and Seme border, Agbara and Seme, in February, we counted 46 checkpoints. So Is that supporting exports? Is that supporting businesses? Your guess is as good as mine. To move goods from the north to the south, motorists pay 73 different levies. So we can understand why costs are rising and why things are difficult. For most of us, we've abandoned the rule of law. We want to do things to help ourselves. And so if your street light says red, at least in Lagos, I cannot speak for Ibadan or your town, but I know in Lagos, when the street light says red, your average Korope and Okada will take red as move. And they keep moving. And you that decides to interpret red as stop. I mean, someone has said to a great uncle of mine that sleep there, Sunsibe. That's the culture that we've adopted. And then you wonder why things are not working. Little drops of water makes an ocean. If we all sleep there, if we all interpret red as move, then really it's going to be difficult for things to be different than the way they are today. If corruption has become ingrained and you have 46 checkpoints between Agbara and Seme, or you pay 73 taxes between the north and the south moving goods, that's the kind of economy that we're going to have, is what we have today. And so we have an economy that is non-competitive and where there is low productivity. Agriculture is the largest employer of labor. Agriculture is also the largest block of our economy in terms of GDP. Yet our productivity in agriculture is very poor. Our maize, in terms of productivity, can be 14 times more if you want to reach or match the world leader. Cassava, we can be more productive by 700% if you want to match the world leader. So you see there's quite a lot of gap. And my sense is that all of these things are symbols. But some causes is because we are selfish and we think for ourselves first. There is lack of consequences. There is lack of consequences, and so people do as they like. And I use the word anyhowness. Our anyhowness is too much. We do things anyhow. There is very limited systems thinking. System thinking says, when I do this, how will it affect something else? If we introduce 46 checkpoints between Agbara and Seme, how would that affect exports? If there is port congestion and exporters spend 2 months to move containers, how would that affect trade? It costs less to move a container from China to Nigeria than it does to move that container from Lagos to Kano. Reality. And so the second order major problem, I think, is that we don't do second order thinking. That was the impact of my action on other things. And so that has led to low productivity, high poverty, and to migration, the Japa syndrome, for those who have the ability to. If you move to the next slide. All of those issues have affected our health. They've affected our education. The best of us have migrated out. In the 90s or so, it was medical doctors migrating to Saudi and the Middle East. Now, it's nurses, pharmacists, pretty much anyone who wants going to UK, Canada, Australia. And we wonder why our health is dysfunctional. Same thing in education. Lecturers have left. The capital budget, the R&D budget for one federal ministry, and I won't mention the name of the federal ministry, but it starts with W. The R&D budget of that ministry this year is more than the capital budget of Unilag, IFE, ABU, and one other federal university. So again, where you allocate resources shows your priority. So we're not spending enough on health, we're not spending enough on education, and we are seeing the action or the impact in the quality of health. Maternal mortality, we are one of 5 or so in the world, lowest. We move to the next slide. So Nigeria is 2% of world population, but we represent 40% of global maternity. And all of that reflects in our poverty. Of the 85 million people that are in the workforce, only 15% have post-secondary school education. Our adult literacy level is about 62%. China, with a population of 1.3 billion, adult literacy level is about 96%. So we are not literate enough, we are not skilled enough, that is leading to poverty. The average Nigerian spends 82% of his income on food, accommodation, and clothing. So that may not be people like you here. But the average Nigerian spends 81.5% on those 3 things. And by the time you add transportation, cell phone, communication, health, education, it's about 94%. So there's nothing left. And that's why it's important that minimum wage be increased, like the president has promised. There's high inequality. The poorest 10% of us consume less than 2% of consumption. So things are tough. Close to half of us don't have access to electricity from the public grid. Less than 1% of us have access to structured credit. Not to talk of insurance. And I think in 2020 or so, 2021, NDIC said less than 4 million of accounts have up to 500,000 naira in their account balance. Now I know not everyone puts money in the bank. Some of us put money under our bed. But for those that put money in their bank accounts, less than 4 million bank accounts had 500,000 naira. So it's a pretty informal economy and things are tough. Next slide. So the next slide talks about the gap in food supply. And it's important because food accounts for a large chunk of our rising inflation. So there's more than a 19% gap in the supply of maize. Maize that you think we have enough of. And there's more than 25% gap in rice and more than 50% gap in soybeans. So we are not producing enough for us to eat. And our production is also of low yield, low quality. Next slide. We'll move fast. So that's Nigeria. We're trying, but we have perennial issues that we've not solved, like power, like insecurity, like food. And those things have been there for over 2-3 decades. And that is really the state of our economy. And that economy is within a global economy. And in terms of the global economy, things are also not easy. So global economy is not easy. Local economy is also not easy. There are 5 global risks for this year. The first being climate change, extreme weather. And if you recall, in 2022, we had flood that affected 33 states. So in the last few weeks, we've seen very high level of heat. So there will be more of that to come. This year will be a year of extreme weather. The second global risk is technology, artificial intelligence, AI, and how they can use it to misinform people. So the point I'm trying to make is Nigeria is operating in a world that is also in a state of flux and with challenges affecting the world. UK, Japan are now in recession. And so the more countries are going to recession, the less the things we can export to them. And that will begin to also affect us in some form. So it's going to be a challenging year. Next slide. More than half of the population on earth will be in countries where there will be elections this year. India, Russia just did its own, US in November. And elections can lead to positive or negative change, depending on who wins the election. Let's move on. I think we've spoken a bit about some of this. So if you then come back to Nigeria, our macroeconomic situation is all red. So whether you are talking about trade, we are not trading enough because all we trade is crude oil really. Or you are talking about FX, or you are talking about inflation, it's all red. And like I said, some of the factors leading to this is insecurity, it's climate change, it's the fact that we don't do value addition. We export crude oil, we import petrol. We export cocoa, we import chocolate. So we don't process enough. We just export raw and then we import the refined one. Electricity accounts for an additional 30-35% of cost for SMEs. In the Niger Delta area, for those in the oil and gas industry, insecurity is additional 20% extra cost. So that means an average company in Nigeria will have 30% extra cost from electricity, from poor power, generating its own power, 20% extra cost from insecurity, that's 50%. So how can your product be competitive when you export it to other clients? Difficult. And that's why all this is red. And so the things we need to do, we need to boost local refinery so that we stop importing PMS or diesel or Jet A1. So Dangote refinery will help. The NNPC refineries should also start working. Some of them should start working this year. So that will help. Our Lekki Deep Port should help to facilitate export and import. The African Free Continental Trade Area create Africa as a bigger market for us so that we can begin to export into those markets. So there's also opportunities. So it's not all gloom. There are also opportunities. Next slide. The other thing to look at in terms of our economy is that the sectors that are growing are the sectors that are not creating jobs. Banking, information technology, those sectors are growing. Financial services, technology are growing, but they're not creating jobs enough. The sectors that will create jobs, manufacturing, agriculture, construction. You know, when you're constructing, you have 1,001 people on the road. Those sectors are not growing enough. And so our growth has got to focus on sectors that can also employ people. Technology employs people, but not enough versus agriculture or versus construction. And so that's the story. So you see a number of green and red, but the thing is we need to grow in sectors where it can lead to jobs. Next slide. So in terms of the headwinds, and I think we've spoken about this, so I think we can move it. So what's the outlook? According to the CBN, and this slide is from a presentation made by the CBN Deputy Governor a few days ago actually. According to the CBN, inflation will start to drop around May. So inflation today is about 32% for headline inflation, and it's likely to get to 33% before it starts to drop. Food inflation is 37%. It's likely to get to 40% before it starts to drop around May. So we still have 2-3 months of rising inflation before it starts dropping. GDP is forecasted to be at above 3% this year, but our population growth rate is 2.8%. So we need GDP to be growing at least 6%, 5.5, 6%, for us to take many people out of poverty. So there's a lot of work for us to do. And this year will be a defining year. We move to the next slide. Next slide tries to compare Nigeria, a few African countries, and with the destinations where we go to. So if you look at this, you see that inflation is high in Nigeria, is high in Ghana, is high in Egypt. Inflation in Egypt is about 33%, same as Nigeria. So things are tough everywhere. If you look at, the one I like is the tax to GDP ratio. Tax to GDP ratio is 10% in Nigeria, is about 23% in South Africa. So you and I, we are not paying enough tax to government. And that's why government doesn't have enough money to do the things they want to do, including a bit of corruption anyway. Poverty rate, more than 50% in South Africa. It's about 40% in Nigeria. So the continent, so Nigeria is struggling. The entire continent is struggling, really. And that's why we're looking at, the African Free Trade Area as an opportunity. Next slide. So, what are the prospects? I think first thing is you need to consider not just Nigeria, but consider Africa as your entire opportunity. So your opportunity is not Nigeria alone, but it's Africa, given the free continental trade area that the government is working on. So there's a market of 1.3 billion people to address. In Nigeria, you have a market of 220 million. In West Africa, a market of above 450 million. But in Africa as a whole, the market above 1 billion. If you can produce goods that can serve them. And we've seen that with Flutterwave, with our banks, with Dangote Cement, with flour mills. They are exporting outside of Nigeria into Africa today. So our population is an opportunity. Our population, the median age, half of us are below the age of 18. So the median age in Nigeria is 18. It is 28 years in India. It's 34 in China. It's 38 in US. The younger you are, the more strength you have to work, the more you consume. So that's where the future is on the continent. Today, Africa is same population as China and India, or is slightly more, 1.4 to 1.3 billion. But by 2050, Africa's population will be like a billion more than India and China. India, China will be 1.6 billion, Africa will be 2.5 billion. Because our fertility rate is high. Whereas it's one family, one child in China, even though they're changing that. In Nigeria, we can borrow more cow more, right? KBC, Kama, Resi. We produce a lot. And fertility rate is like 6 in the north. It's lower. I have 10 minutes more. Fertility rate is lower in the south, but it's higher in the north. And the same thing in a number of African countries. And so because of that, there will be that huge population. Now, some people have said, I think Goldman Sachs said, that population of 2.5 billion in 2050 may only account for 11% of productivity in the world. If that is true, then there will be a crisis. Because you have mouths that are hungry. And there will be social crisis. So we have the obligation to ensure that our rising population becomes a dividend and not a crisis for us. The continent is going through a crisis today, and in my view, that crisis presents opportunities for those who are discerning. We had the World War in 1914 to 1918. After that First World War, in 1919, was when the hospitality company, the Hilton Hotel, was formed. So Hilton Hotel was formed in 1919, just after we ended the First World War. Yeah. So in the moment of crisis, there are opportunities, right? We had a global economic crisis in 2008, the mortgage crisis, starting from the US. But it was in the middle of that crisis that WhatsApp was established, that some guys created Instagram. It was in the middle of that crisis that Airbnb was formed. So in the middle of crisis, some people see opportunity. So Nigeria is in a tough situation. But I tell you, it's also an opportunity, and many are seeing the opportunities. In 1990, Fola Viola and Tayo, in their mid-30s, formed Guarantee Trust Bank in the middle of this tough country. Right? In 2002, still a tough country, 36-year-old Aigboje and Herbert established or bought over Access Bank in a very tough country where there's no light, there's no water, just like we don't have it today. In that same crisis that Nigeria is, or that tough environment, Inyaboyeji at age 23 and 4 others formed Andela. That's now a $2 billion valued company. That same Inyaboyeji at age 25 joined 2 others to form Flutterwave. At age 30, he joined a few others to form Move, the Uber company, all those small cars that you see around. So in the middle of crisis, some people are turning crisis to opportunities. So 2024, here we are. In 2034, they will say in that middle of crisis is 2024, ABC formed XYZ. Would that be you? So don't let us just look at the negative side. Let's look for the opportunities. There is no power. Some people have gone into inverter business. Some people have become merchants of diesel. Some have become merchants of solar. And there is no power, but they are benefiting from that crisis. Next slide. So the continent, because the continent is yet to be developed, it presents an opportunity. So don't see the economic crisis as something that's affecting you, but see it as something that is presenting an opportunity for you. We need to feed Africans. We need to feed 1.4 billion people. We need to clothe them. They must wear clothing. They must sleep under a roof. They must listen to music or whatever. They must communicate. They must call. And so MTN is making money. And so let's see the opportunity, even as we see the crisis. Next slide. I think you should move on. To 2 more slides forward. So, I sincerely believe that this economy can grow to become a $1 trillion economy by the decade, by 2030, 2031, thereabouts. If you do a few things. And there are 3 pathways. First is exporting, but exporting processed goods. Second is our knowledge area, the technology guys, the entertainment guys, services, and see how we can promote them. And third pathway, it's regional value chains. What is the Southwest good earth? What is the Northwest good earth? What is the Northeast good earth? And how can we, in those regions, all work together? Those are the 3 pathways. And the pathways are not mutually exclusive. You can do all together. If you move to the next slide, there are 15 things we need to take as priorities for us to overcome these challenges. First is we need to improve the competitiveness of our market. So that means electricity must be sorted out. We must have ability to process manufacturing so that we are not just not exporting raw items, but we are processing them. We must target sectors that create jobs so that our 200 million people can have jobs. We must diversify our products. Crude oil and gas cannot continue to be 95% of our exports. We must export more beyond crude oil and gas. And we must develop the value chain. So, you plant cocoa, you process it, you brand it into chocolate, you distribute it. All of those can be done in the country. Not that we export it out and we then bring in processed items. We must focus on digital technology. Technology, infrastructure, health, education are things we must invest in. Just like also we must have regional infrastructure development. So in the Southwest, they're talking of a train to connect all the states in the Southwest. Ogun wants to connect the red line to get to Songo. They want to connect the blue to get to Agbara. That's where it should all be. So that it's not just Lagos as the center of, as the only excellence area. All other states must also, so we must have those regional connections. Next slide. That is 2 more slides, Charlie. 2 more slides. So if we do some of those things, we can become a $1 trillion economy where everybody is prosperous. And to be a $1 trillion economy, we need to be growing at least 5.56%. The last time we grew 6%, actually 6.6%, was during the Obasanjo period, 2000 2010. And that growth was because crude oil, we were producing up to 2 million barrels of crude oil. Today, last year we were producing 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion. Last month we produced 1.6 billion. So it's increasing. But we need to, the more crude oil we produce and the steady the crude oil prices, that will give us money. Because crude oil is 96% of our exports anyway. And that money we can then use to sort out power, to sort out security. Security we must sort out. Power we must sort out. We've seen from other countries, the Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, they all did it. They doubled their economy. So it's possible for us to double it if we allow the private sector to thrive. And for the private sector to thrive, at least 3 things we must do. Security we must improve. Electricity, stable, cheap, affordable power, and of course must allow ease of doing business so that private sector can do what they do best. Next slide. But beyond what the government must do is also what you and I need to do. We must solve for the community instead of solving for ourselves. We must believe in the nation. We must believe in the country. We must act with integrity. We must be willing to sacrifice instead of wanting to hoard everything for ourselves. We must be more productive, make in Nigeria, and also consume and buy things that are made in Nigeria. Next slide. And that's my last slide. And lastly, we must obey the rule of law. Okay. We must obey the rule of law. Once you obey the rule of law, then there is orderliness. We should not despair in the mercy of Allah. La taqnatu min rahmati. Do not despair of the mercy of Allah. As Muslims, we believe if we show repentance, tawakkul, if you have faith in Allah, if you rely on Him, and if you do the right thing, forgiveness and do the right things, follow His laws and we obey Him, Allah's mercy will shine on us. And Allah has said that He will not change the condition of a people until they change what's in themselves. So this country will not change if you and I continue to do the things we do. We are not orderly, we are corrupt, we solve for ourselves instead of solving for the nation. So a lot we expect from our government, but also a lot we also can do. And it takes 2 to tango. And if we all work together and we believe in the mercy of Allah and we change our behaviors and do small things well, then on the aggregate, this economy can improve. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdi. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun alal mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Ramadan